This is going to be an interesting kind of 5, 6 or 7 weeks. What I'm kind of interested in doing in particular is trying to see what happens when these ideas get kind of thrown at such an incredibly diverse group of people. So we have a lot of people here who have archaeological backgrounds. We have a bunch of people here with philosophical backgrounds. There are some people with historical backgrounds. So it's going to be kind of a bit wild. And I think that can work. It can be good if the way that you sort of approach these is, you're someone who has a particular set of interests and a particular set of skills that are going to hopefully interact with the sorts of things we're going to be talking about in an interesting and fun way. And so there may be a lot of things that I say, maybe everything I say, that seems kind of ridiculous from your disciplinary perspective, right? If you're someone who's an archaeologist who's done a lot of archaeological theory, you'll find that the way that philosophers think about this is often almost simple-minded in compared to the way that archaeologists think about it. And hopefully we might be able to play around a little bit with why there are those sorts of differences. So my hope is if you're someone who's coming here from a sort of philosophical background, you'll get to learn a bit about this kind of very strange thing that's happening in this area of philosophy of science at the moment, where we've started thinking very hard about knowledge of the deep past. And for those of you who come from other disciplines, it's going to be honest, very helpful to me to hear the sorts of things you all have to say. So I think the way I'm going to run this is basically, I've got some slides. I'm going to kind of walk through a lecture. I think I haven't decided as yet to what extent I'm going to sort of force you all to talk, right? This is, I've been thinking of this as a graduate course, and standardly in a graduate course, if this was a normal graduate course, I would not have slides. I would show up and be like, so we read the paper, what do we think? But as these are being sort of recorded, and as we have such a diverse bunch of people from different disciplines, it suggests that me doing that perhaps would not work as well. And so what I'm going to do instead is, at least for this session, make it very kind of lecture-y. But I want to at first lay a few sort of easy ground rules here. Be very welcome to use the chat. So particularly with these kinds of sessions, some people have like bad internet, some people haven't had a shower today and don't want everyone to see their faces. That's all good. But if you do want to ask a question, feel free to just throw things in the chat as we go. What I'll do is I'll ignore you until I come to bits where I'll stop and check the chat. That's how we'll do that. Also, use the hand function. I presume we're all like pros at Zoom by this case, but in case you're somehow not, you'll see if you move your little cursor around, you'll see a little smiley face with a plus with reactions written under it. If you use that, you can both give reactions to what I'm doing. We can just throw out that whenever I say something clever if you want. But more importantly, you can use the raise hand function, which will mean that I can see that, hey, your hand's up, you want to jump in, and that'll let me do that. And if that's too confusing, just write in chat, I want to say a thing, and I'll be able to call on you. So if I'm not getting, just sort of side note, if no one's doing any of that, if I'm not getting any raised hands or anything in the chat, then I'm going to use breakout rooms. This is my kind of, because part of this is really about getting you all to talk to each other as well as talk to me. And so do feel free to start sort of throwing sort of comments and questions into the chat or raising your hand if you want to come in during the discussion. That clear enough to everyone? Anyone got any questions right at this moment? Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to share my little screen. Okay, so I think I'm going to start with a very old school thing for me, which is kind of the way I open the book Rock, Bone and Ruin. And I'm doing this as a way of kind of motivating why we might care about something like paleontology if you're a philosopher or just someone interested in what science is like regardless. And so the way I'm going to start this is by introducing us to this platypus. This is Obdurodon therexulchild. So this is a platypus that lived in Australia, unsurprisingly, maybe 10 to 15 million years ago. There's a few things about it that make it quite different to modern platypus. You'll notice if you look at its mouth there that it's got teeth. Most platypuses lose their teeth when they become adults. You also notice that it's eating a soft-shelled turtle. That's a very different type of prey that platypuses typically eat. Platypuses usually eat small crustaceans. The main difference, though, is that this platypus is extremely large. This platypus is a meter long. Most platypuses are about half that length. So this is a very, very, very large platypus. In fact, it was called Platyzilla, unsurprisingly, by the press when it was first published. So we know a lot about this platypus. We know about its environment, we know its size, we have some ideas about its diet, so on and so forth. And this is somewhat remarkable because the sum and total physical remains we have of this platypus is a single tooth. We have a single molar, and there's this idea that from this single molar, we're able to draw this enormous amount of information. And typically when I give this to students, often I like this as a case to sort of get us thinking about the nature of historical evidence. There's a bunch of things that's quite surprising about this, which I think kind of bring out a lot of the ways in which folks tend to worry about historical evidence. So people who think about paleontology or archaeology or geology, these so-called historical sciences, often are worried that they're somehow not real sciences. And one way you can motivate this idea that these aren't real sciences is by sort of just thinking about all the things that are kind of weird about trying to infer the existence of a giant platypus millions of years ago from not really a single tooth, but a single funny shaped rock, keep in mind. One of the most obvious ones people go to is a lack of experimentation. If you go and Google scientific method on the internet, you'll find lots of sort of flow diagrams that often involve make a hypothesis, build an experiment that tests the hypothesis, see how that goes, right? This notion of being able to manipulate the system of interest, the thing that you want to know about, is often understood as just being the bulwark. That's what makes something scientific. And people often think, well, you cannot experiment on the past, and therefore you cannot have a science of the past. That's a very common sort of claim. Another thing you might point out, which of course is related to not being able to experiment, is that things in the past seem to be often kind of unique and not repeatable. We just have a single tooth. I don't have, in this case, many teeth. So how am I supposed to repeat my experiments or repeat my inferences? How am I supposed to bring together many different instances in order to form a sort of a hypothesis or something like that? Another thing people often point to is a lack of laws. A sort of common way of thinking about science is what scientists do is they use experiments to establish laws, to establish these robust regularities in the kind of shape of the way the world is, right? So often people say that, the great achievements of physics are to do with physics having these cool equations that describe so much of the way things are. And of course, with things like paleontology, you might point to the record being really degraded. There's a huge amount of things that were in the past that have not left traces. We know very well that fossilization is a very rare process. Most of the things that have existed have not been preserved, and those things that have been preserved badly. And that suggests that the evidence we have to work on is really, really bad. So if you were to just think about trying to understand the past in terms of things, what people often say when they think about scientific method, right? You experiment, you have repeatable evidence, you uncover laws, and you have sort of rich evidence, then these sciences look bad. They look unfortunate. And people kind of often say they're not sciences. Now, we're not going to bother saying they're not sciences very much here. I think that's a fairly uninteresting answer, but it's something that we can sort of play around with if we so want to. Oh yes, also you might say that our background theories are not very good, right? We don't know very much about the past in a sense, and because we don't know very much about the past, we're not able to construct these sort of rich, well-supported hypotheses. So I guess in response to this, we might ask, how did we make this inference from a single tooth to this platypus? And the answer, I think, is kind of interesting. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about that because I always think it's good to start a sort of lecture by talking about tooth morphology, because I just think people love tooth morphology. It's just an exciting topic. People are talking about it all the time. Here's a tooth. So the bit of information we want here about this tooth is the talonid basin and the trigonid. The trigonid is that sort of pyramidal kind of structure and the talonid basin is the sort of other side of it. There's a homologous structure in the upper jaw that has the talonid and the trigonid basin, and those sort of link into each other when you close your mouth, or at least when people who have more symmetrical mouths than me do, mine kind of don't line up properly. But anyway, um, uh, it turns out that in the talonid, in platypuses and platypuses alone, the talonid and the trigonid are symmetrical. They're the same sort of size. It turns out there's this particular trait in the molar that platypus have and other mammals don't. And you might think, well, why is that something that might be so important? And part of the answer to that is about what makes mammals so clever, so awesome, so interesting. What is that? Well, we chew really well. That's the thing that makes mammals special in many ways, is that we're very good at chewing. For instance, we can do this. I can move my jaw a lot more than a bird or a reptile. They just have this kind of nonsense. We have a lot more range of movement with our teeth. We are creatures that are built to chew. And this means that the teeth of mammals are extremely finely tuned to the way that mammal lives and the kind of mammal that it is. And so it turns out that comparative morphologists and paleontologists are all very, very in agreement with the idea that if you have this particular feature, symmetry between the trigonid and the talonid, then you have yourself a platypus. But how do we know about the size of the platypus? Well, we do have teeth of other platypus, of other extinct platypus. Here we've got the platypus we're interested in, Platyzilla on the left. On the right, we have Dickinsoni, which is another extinct platypus. And we have more than that one's tooth. We also have some other bits of its fossils. And that one that tooth is about half the size of the one that we have of Platyzilla. Why does that matter? Well, if you're a mammal, it turns out that the size of your tooth tracks the size of your body, like just proportionately. As I increase the size of the tooth, I increase the size of the body. As I decrease the size of the tooth, I decrease the size of the body. That's not true it's not true for birds because they don't have teeth, but it's also not true for any other animal, for sharks, for other fish, for reptiles and lizards. Sauropod dinosaurs, for instance, had heads about the size of roughly a horse's, but they had sort of 30-meter long bodies. If you're a mammal, because we're all about chewing, because we've got to have enough space for our fancy teeth, it means that as you increase and decrease the size of your teeth, you increase and decrease the size of your body as well. And so because of this feature, as a mammal, if I've got a mammal tooth, I'm able to infer its size. Now, of course, there's many more questions we might have about this critter. We might ask sort of, how are they confident, if they are, about the kind of ecology it had, and so forth. Much of this reconstruction is really speculative, of course, but they're very confident on the size and that it's a platypus. And hopefully you can start to see why. Part of the question is, despite the lack of experimentation, even though this is just a single tooth, there do seem to be maybe some regularities we can use, right? As I said, there's a regularity between the size of your tooth and the size of your body if you're a mammal. The record is degraded, but that doesn't mean it's not extremely information rich. And one thing you notice is that scientists are incredibly good at navigating between the different bits of the record that we have. So in addition to having this one tooth, it's just a mistake to say that the only evidence we have is the one tooth. We also have the tooth of Dickinsoni. We also have other living platypuses. We also have mammals more generally. We also spoke about reptiles and fish, right? There's this way in which paleontologists integrate a whole bunch of different perspectives. And in these ways, actually, often our background theories are not, as it were, crappy. They're actually incredibly rich and incredibly powerful. And so one of the things I think is sort of interesting and important about thinking about sciences like paleontology and archaeology and geology and cosmology, the historical sciences, when we're doing the philosophy of science, is that I think they really buck a bunch of trends. They behave in ways that scientists, in a sense, are not supposed to behave like, according to the traditional things that both philosophers and also other scientists say. And in my view, they shouldn't apologize about this, right? If you're a paleontologist or an archaeologist, what you shouldn't be doing is trying to show that you're like physics or show that you're like chemistry. Rather, you should be explaining what your own kind of method is. So this is just by means of a kind of introduction. I do want to sort of quickly sketch what's going to be happening over the next 7 weeks, because as was mentioned in the introduction, this is something of an experiment. And it's an experiment not simply because we're going to be trying to do a graduate course mostly online in this way, but also because I'm going to sort of do it based on a lot of guests. I thought that it would be really interesting to try and do this by bringing in a lot of people. Partly I'm doing this because I kind of want to read these people's work more carefully than I have in the past, so I get sort of something out of this as well. And the way I thought we would do it would be actually divide the sessions into 2 groups, right? And so there's going to be a session usually on the Tuesdays, which are going to be kind of me and hopefully you as well, kind of explaining the paper, right? I kind of feel like often when the author is there, that makes people talk and think about the author, the work in a different way, right? Maybe we're afraid of offending the author, something like that. And so it can be nice to meet beforehand, which enables us to sort of hammer out the kinds of things we might have and kind of questions we might have. Then on the Thursdays, we'll bring in the guests. So that's the way the sort of structure is going to work. So Tuesday is sort of us together looking at the paper, getting confused about it together, maybe thinking there are things that are good and things that are bad, so on and so forth. Then on Thursday, we'll bring in the guest and we'll have maybe a set of questions that we already want to ask them. And that might be more like a sort of conversation, and hopefully a conversation not just between me and the guest, but between the others as well. So this is the concept I have. Whether it works, I guess we'll find out. These things always have an element of risk in them. But what I want to do today, my main aim today, is to kind of do a sketch of the way that philosophy of historical science has gone in the last 20 years, and then kind of take it to this paper that I've sort of set for today, this recent Stepping Forwards by Looking Back paper. The kind of reason I wanted to do this is that I sort of see this paper as sort of my latest sort of thoughts on what's been kind of the main debate, I think, in the philosophy of the historical sciences the last 20 years. In a sense, I kind of wrote this paper to try and make this debate not happen anymore. So something that's kind of amusing here is I'm going through a debate which in the paper I say is a debate we shouldn't have. Now, it might be that I'm wrong. It might be that you think this is a good debate to have. And so I'm very happy to hear that because, it's a debate I've engaged in. So it'd be great if other people also do. But also, I think it's useful sort of historical context to get a sense of where people are coming from. And so that's sort of my aim in the next 2 weeks, really, is to give us a set of background and sort of resource that we might use to then, as we go forwards, start engaging with other people who are working in this area. So that's our sort of plan for today. Let's get going. There are 2 questions that, it's quite late here, so I'm having a glass of wine. I'm in Copenhagen in a hotel room, by the way. This is why my internet's going to be next week I'll be in a hotel room in Hamburg. But then next week, I'll be at home, and then I'll have very, very fun internet, and it'll be very fancy. But tonight, it's just me in a weird little hotel in Copenhagen. This is the first proper traveling I've done since the pandemic, so it's quite exciting. But anyway, so there are really 2 questions, I think, that have kind of enlivened philosophers about the historical sciences in the last 20 years. And it's worth pointing out that this is a sort of particular debate that's about the historical sciences, the set of sciences, but there's lots of stuff going on kind of within them as well, right? So there are people who are asking particular questions about, how archaeologists do stuff, how paleontologists do stuff, various bits of theory within those questions. But here, in terms of what you might think of as traditional philosophy of science, where traditional philosophy of science is sort of asking something like, how does science work? That's the kind of question. There are sort of 2 sort of main things people kind of disagree with. The first is about the method. Is there a particular method that's associated with the historical sciences? So when I say the historical sciences, is there a particular way of doing business that is particular to them? So that's the first question. And the second is about whether they're any good. So are the historical sciences impoverished in comparison to other sciences, most typically sort of experimental sciences? Now, the way I'm going to discuss this, the way I'm going to go through this, is really going to involve focusing on kind of two figures, Carol Cleland and Derek Turner, and that involves me sort of, abstracting a bit from the debate. There's a bunch of other people who are kind of jumping in and sort of saying stuff here, but it makes for at least a nice, neat lecture when I sort of produce this in terms of Carol and Derek kind of having a debate with each other. That's the way I'm going to present it, but as with any lecture, there is sort of some abstraction there. And the idea is when I get through this, I'll then be able to sort of smoothly transition into the sort of points I make in the paper that we've read. So what I'm going to do is sort of go through Carol's view, and then what I'm probably going to do is stop and see where you all are at, make sure that things are sort of making sense thus far. I presume, given the lack of hands and the lack of chats, that everything I'm saying at this point makes perfect sense. Either that, or you have no way of understanding my weird Kiwi accent, at which point maybe you could watch the video later or something. But let's look at Carol Cleland's view. So Cleland comes out in sort of 2002, 2001, 2002. She publishes a couple of papers. And what she's really trying to do in these papers is answer the sort of charge that I've started us with. The charge is, hey, the historical sciences are not scientific because they do not have experiments. And it's very easy to find people saying this. It's very easy to find various sort of scientists saying, look, the historical nature of things like paleontology and archaeology inherently make them not scientific. And Cleland wants to say that that's wrong. She wants to say that there are actually two different ways, at least two different ways of being a scientist. And so what she wants to give you is an account of the method of the historical sciences. And she says, and she's got a kind of surprising, her first move is kind of surprising. She says, look, if you're doing historical research, what you're doing is you're explaining existing natural phenomena in terms of long past causes. And I find this immediately quite surprising, right? If you ask me what is paleontology about, I would say, oh, it's about dinosaurs or something. It's about extinct life. But actually what Carol would say is, well, actually, no, it's on understanding things now in terms of their past causes. So in a sense, for her, paleontology is about fossils. Archaeology is about the archaeological record and archaeological assemblages. It's not really about past cultures. We think about past cultures in order to explain and understand those assemblages. That seems to be sort of part of her view. One way of sort of getting at the way she thinks about this, which I find sort of simple, is to think about kind of 19th century geology. So here we have an erratic rock. This is a particular type of geological feature that's pretty common in across the top of the northern hemisphere. This one's in Devon, where I live now. So what's funny about erratic rocks? Well, they're rocks that are made of different minerals than the rocks around them. They're erratic. It's not clear what they're doing there. And there's a way of thinking of lots of 19th century geology as basically being, how did that thing get there? Right? So how come there's this funny rock here? What could have happened? And what you might do is you might generate a bunch of sort of ideas. Or maybe it turned out that there was a different type of mountain here and that degraded. Maybe there was a big river. Maybe an earthquake brought it up from the top, something like this. Or maybe it was a glacier. Maybe there were glaciers here, right? And of course, erratic rocks are things that are carried along on glaciers. So if you find erratic rocks, you then got a very good reason to think that there was a glacier here. And so there's this idea that when you do historical science, like the sort of paradigmatic method, is you notice something weird about the current world. Why do I see this kind of pattern? And then what you do is you posit things in the past to try and explain that pattern. And she's got a kind of strategy here. So what she's going to do is she's going to give us two prototypical research strategies. There's the way you do science when you're an experimental science and the way you do science when you're a historical science. And she's going to say that you adopt those strategies due to particular epistemic situations. So that's due to the kind of context you're in, let's put it that way. I'm not going to go much into that second point because it gets a bit kind of freaky, but roughly the idea is when I'm trying to find out about the past, because it's the past, I have a different set of challenges than if I'm trying to find out about the future, right? So she thinks there's a temporal asymmetry going on, which I can explain, but I don't want to. But you can force me to if you want to. There's this idea that each practice, being an experimental scientist or a historical scientist, is tailored to exploit the information that nature puts at its disposal. Should be our disposal, I'm guessing. And the character of that information is different. And so neither practice could be held up as more objective or rational than the other. So if you come to me and say, hey, experimental science is better than historical science, Cleland's response is going to be, wait, that's the wrong question. These are doing different things. So you can't really compare them in the right way. You can't be an experimental scientist if you're trying to find out about the past, and you can't be an historical scientist if you're trying to find out about the future, is the sort of idea. So you've got two different methods which are geared towards trying to find out about the past and trying to find out about the future. And because the past and the future are different, they have different types of information, you can't compare the two things. That is different ways of doing business, which I think is, you can see why that might be attractive. So when you're describing Cleland's view, it's basically a law that you have to do it by talking about the big impact event which potentially caused the dinosaur extinction 66 million years ago. And far be it from me to break that law, so I'm going to briefly just sketch her view using this example. So here we have some things we see now, some things in the present. The one at the top there is some shocked quartz. Quartz gets shocked when it's put under enormous amounts of pressure. So you'll find shocked quartz around impact sites from like meteors, and you'll find them around nuclear explosions. In the middle there, we have a sort of the KPG line. There we have a layer of iridium. There's a lot of iridium, some deep under the Earth. There's a fair bit of it in space, but it's quite rare to have it sort of form in strata like that. And then the bottom one there is supposed to represent a change in the patterns of fossils. So go below 66 million years, and there's lots of, triceratops and other sorts of dinosaurs. You go above that line, and you've got no non-avian dinosaurs. So there seems to be a kind of extinction event. And so these are three things we see correlated now. Remember what we did with the erratic rock? We went, well, what could do that? What sorts of things could have occurred in the past that would lead me to expect these types of things to be seen in the future? Well, maybe it was a volcano, or at least lots of volcanoes, a lot of volcanism. After all, large amounts of volcanoes going off have been associated with other mass extinctions. And also, if you have a lot of volcanism, that can increase the amount of iridium in sediments, strata, because they, as it were, pull the iridium up and squirt it all over the place, roughly. I don't understand how volcanoes work. I'm sure that's how that goes. Or you could say a great big rock hit the Earth, right? And you have these hypotheses, and you say, well, which of these hypotheses is better supported? The first thing you might do is you might point out the following. You might point out that the volcano explains only two of the things in the present. It explains the lack of dinosaurs, and it explains the layer of iridium, but it doesn't explain the shocked quartz. Volcanic activity doesn't shock quartz. You might point out that the big rock does explain those three things, right? If it's an iridium-rich meteor that predicts that set of iridium, it can kill lots of things. Potentially a great big rock could cause a mass extinction, maybe. And it can definitely shock that quartz. And so what Cleland's going to say is, well, because it unifies more of those current traces, those current observations, it then is better supported. Us then finding a really big impact crater. So this is using paleomagnetic resonance. Turns out there's a great big crater sort of off the coast of Mexico that dates to around about the same time, seems to very much kind of clinch the deal. You might think that finding the crater acts as something like a smoking gun, which is really Cleland's kind of central metaphor, which he thinks about historical reasoning. There's this idea that what you do paradigmatically when you're an historical scientist is you first find a bunch of weird correlations. What is this funny rock doing here? Why do I see a lack of dinosaurs at the same time as I see a layer of iridium, right? You reveal these sort of traces through doing field work, and then you do some hypothesizing. You say, well, what things, if they did happen in the past, would explain what I see now? What will explain those correlations? And then what I do is I go back to the field work. I look for further traces, which if I found them, would distinguish, would allow me to prefer one hypothesized event over another. And so this is this method that she calls sort of smoking gun reasoning. And as we go forward, it's going to get a little bit more nuanced, but this is sort of the idea. And remember, the thought is that this is a way of doing science that is justified, but different from what you're doing when you're doing experimental science. Very briefly, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the way that Cleland thinks about experimental science is that you have a sort of experimental apparatus. You're generating a prediction about something general, right? And then what you're doing is you're controlling for false positives and false negatives. And so you're sort of slowly changing those experimental conditions in order to control for sort of possible confounders to that generalization. And so in historical science, you're interested in token events. You're interested in this, what was the thing that caused these traces that I see? Whereas in experimental science, you're interested in regularities, laws. In experimental science, you are changing this experimental system in order to control for confounders. In historical science, you're looking for smoking guns. You've generated a bunch of hypotheses, and those hypotheses then generate a bunch of tests. What traces should I expect to see? If a great big rock hit the Earth, probably I should be able to find a great big crater associated with that great big rock so I can go looking for it. That's the kind of idea. So she says these hypotheses concerning long past token events are evaluated in terms of their capacities to explain puzzling associations among traces discovered through fieldwork. And so in Carroll's view, you see this very strong connection between a certain type of hypothesizing, a certain type of reasoning, and a certain type of sort of fieldwork approach, where you're going and looking for traces that will test those hypotheses. And sort of philosophically speaking, there's an appeal here to what's often called common cause explanation. There's kind of this idea that an explanation which cites one cause for a set of events is more likely to be true than one which cites several causes. And this is the kind of sort of reasoning we do sort of all the time. So an example that I use in a few places is a thing that happened to me when I came home once during my PhD. And I found that my the house was all messed up, which was kind of weird. It's not how I left it. I found that my banjo was missing, and I found that the window was open, or the window was broken, rather. And what I didn't do was start going, oh, that's really surprising that these three events overlap with one another. No, it's that I've been robbed, right? Once I posit me being robbed, these three apparently surprising events are no longer surprising. By citing a common cause, I make these three events, which should be unlikely, become pretty likely. I mean, assuming that you're in a place where for some reason someone would steal your banjo anyway. I'm still not sure why you would bother stealing a banjo, but I presume they took it home and learned to play it, and it turned them from their life of crime, and now they're, I don't know, a famous banjo player or something. That's my hope. So, so there's this kind of reasoning which is very commonsensical that Cleland takes to be going on in the background here. So a couple of subtleties, and then I'm going to sort of pause and sort of see how we're going. So the first subtlety is to do with what she really means by the evidence from a smoking gun. There are ways in which the metaphor of a smoking gun, I think, are quite different to what her view actually is. Now, you might think of a smoking gun as something which kind of clinches the deal in a certain way. So she says, a smoking gun does not uniquely determine a hypothesis outside of the context of a set of specific competing hypotheses. It merely establishes that one of them is superior when it comes to causally explaining the traces thus far observed. So what she's saying there is you shouldn't think about smoking guns like they were sort of a critical experiment or something like that. Smoking guns can be very, very dispersed. In later work, as people start pushing back more, she ends up saying, no, just any set of things can be a smoking gun. All it takes to be a smoking gun is a set of traces that together give you reason to prefer one hypothesis over another. And so actually they can be very dispersed. They can be sort of, require a lot of statistics and a lot of inference. They don't have to be as obvious as finding a great big hole in the earth. Right? And so that's kind of an important thing to note with Cleland's view, is that actually it's more subtle than just look for a great big hole in the earth. The other is to do with the kind of position she's developing, and this is where it gets kind of tricksy. So as I'm often the type of philosopher where I want to be able to like nail someone down and say you're wrong because you think this, and that's very difficult to do with Cleland's view, because what she's not doing is saying if you're a paleontologist, if you're an archaeologist, all you do is run around looking for new traces to test hypotheses. Here she's saying there is overlap. She means there's overlap between being an experimental scientist and being a historical scientist. She thinks there are fundamental methodological differences between prototypical experimental and prototypical historical work. So one way of thinking about this is it's like she's giving a model of the reasoning, if that makes sense. She's not saying, what you might think is you might think that it's very easy to show that Cleland's view is false. I just need to go and find a paleontologist or an archaeologist doing an experiment. And indeed, that's very easy to do. Paleontologists and archaeologists do experiments all the time, right? But that's not what she's doing. What she's doing is she's saying, here's the sort of paradigm prototypical kind of reasoning. And what she'll say is, when a paleontologist or an archaeologist is doing an experiment, they're doing it towards being able to find smoking guns. Right? So the aim of the experiment is to perhaps test the kind of theory you need in order to interpret the fossil record or the archaeological record. And that makes you better at finding smoking guns. But regardless, it's this kind of view where, because she's giving you a sort of model of reasoning, you can't just point to counter examples. You have to do something kind of more subtle in order to sort of suggest that, Cleland's doing something wrong. So to kind of check where we're at, we have this kind of basic worry that folks in working in archaeology and paleontology have all the time. It's something which some people accuse paleontology and archaeology of doing sometimes, which is sort of thinking that which is being bad science or not being a science. Cleland responds as follows. She says, look, actually there's just different scientific methods. There's the method of being an experimental scientist and the method of being an historical scientist. Those are different. And so then when you ask, well, are they impoverished? She says, well, they're not really comparable. They're simply doing different things. And so you're making a mistake if you try and compare them. So I just want to pause before I switch on, spend a little bit of time talking about Derek's view. I just want to see if anyone has any questions at this stage. Cool. I work under the assumption that this is because I am extremely clear. So what we'll do now is bring in this other voice. So I'll spend less time on Derek, but I bring Derek in, and then I'm going to see what you'll think, because he's going to give a much more sort of pessimistic account. He thinks it's he doesn't think we should be as sort of happy about the historical sciences as Carroll does, in a certain sense, anyway. And one way of getting at what Turner is interested in, this is Derek Turner, is he's interested in a sort of debate that philosophers of science have sometimes called realism. And the realism debate is a debate that I try very hard to not get involved with, because anything that philosophers have been talking about for too long starts to end up kind of eating its own tail. And I think realism is eating its own tail at this point. But regardless, when you're asking questions about realism, you're asking questions like, should we believe what scientists say? When scientists posit entities, when they say there are weather systems, there are viruses, there are atoms, right? Are the things they're positing real entities? Are they carving nature at the joints, if you want? You might also, if you're a realist, you might think that science really progresses. Perhaps it progresses towards more truth or something like that. Whereas anti-realists question whether or not science progresses. And a lot of the discussion of realism has really focused around what are often called unobservable entities. And these are typically the things that you can only see by using particular apparatus. So think about electrons, these kinds of things. There's this idea that there are things that I can sort of see with the naked eye somehow, or interact with my own senses. These are often called sort of observables. And there are things that I cannot interact with my own senses. And there's this idea that these things are kind of underdetermined in a way that I'll describe in a moment. But a very popular type of anti-realist, at least back in the sort of 80s and 90s, would argue that when you're doing science of these unobservable entities, what you're really interested in doing is, as it were, saving the phenomena. You're saving the thing that you see. Right? Where seeing is things like the readout that I get from the experiment that I've done, or something like that. And when I start talking about what's causing that, when I start talking about the atoms or the electrons or the quarks, those sorts of things, I shouldn't take those very seriously. Those aren't very serious metaphysical claims. Rather, they're claims that are helpful for me to then explain what I kind of see. Right? So Turner is coming into this sort of debate, and you can kind of sort of start to sort of see why. So anti-realist, a very common argument for anti-realism, it's not Bas van Fraasen's one, but still, is to point out that when we're thinking about unobservables, some of those features that those unobservables might have are often underdetermined. Here's some philosophy talk. We can think about underdetermination as a relationship between a theory and a hypothesis, and at least one competing theory or hypothesis and some body of evidence. So you've got a theory or hypothesis, right? And you've got a competing theory, right? You've got the theory that, that these can't both be true, they're mutually exclusive. And then you've got a body of evidence, and that body of evidence doesn't tell you to believe one or the other, right? And so that is when you have something being epistemically underdetermined. And there are lots of different versions of that. There are versions where I might say, for any possible hypothesis and any possible set of evidence, I'm going to have underdetermination. That's not the one we're interested in. We're interested in local underdetermination in the sense that, in fact, the fossil records say is going to underdetermine many of the things we would like to know about the past, right? And so one sort of thing you might want to grapple with if you're thinking about the past in terms of these unobservables is to ask, well, is the past in fact observable, right? So when people talk about unobservables, they talk about little things. They're interested in things that are too small to see. But there are also things that we can't see because of our temporal location. Now, for Van Fraasen, I believe he thinks these, in fact, are observable, because what matters for observability is if we were in a place to see them, would we be able to? Yes, for a Dickinsoni, no for an electron. But I think Derek's more happy to say, or at least used to be more happy to say, that these are in fact unobservable. So Derek Turner develops over a book and a few papers around about the same time as Cleland this picture that says, actually, we should be anti-realists about the past in a sense that we shouldn't think that we're going to learn as much about the past. We shouldn't take the claims of paleontologists as seriously as we should from those who do experimental work, right? And this is because of sort of two main things. And again, this shouldn't be particularly surprising given what I said at the very start of the lecture, right? One is information decay. So historical processes destroy information, and we can't do anything about it, right? We can't do experiments to increase the amount of data that we have. So as Turner says, in historical science, background theories tell us how nature has destroyed the evidence. In experimental science, they tell us how to make new evidence. So to explain this, background theories are just the theories that we have to connect our evidence with our hypotheses or something like this. If you look at something like taphonomy, the science of fossilization, you're going to find that a lot of the time it gives us this sort of counsel of despair. It says, hey, you're just not going to find out very much. Why? Because taphonomy tells us that very little will be fossilized. Whereas if you look at background theories in experimental sciences, the background theories help us make new apparatus. They help us find new ways of sort of generating evidence. They're productive in a particular way. And so experiments and background theories in experimental science generates new evidence, while historical scientists are kind of left to nature's mercy. They're sort of beholden to what information has been retained, and often nature is not going to leave much information for them, right? And so they're in a kind of sad situation, if you sort of want. And one way of thinking about this is to think about what Elliot Sober has called a sort of information destroying process. So here's a very abstract example of an information destroying process which Sober and a bunch of other people have used. Imagine that I'm dropping sort of balls into a sort of concave bowl, and imagine the bowl is sort of super concave. If I were to drop the ball from the position it's at now, it'll end up eventually in the center of the bowl. If I were to drop the ball from another With my New Zealand accent, ball and bowl sound very similar, which makes this example extremely bad, but oh well. If I drop the ball from a different position on the bowl, then it's going to also end up in the same place, right? No matter where I drop that ball on the lid of that bowl, it's going to end up at the center. Why does that matter? Well, if I know that the ball is in the center of that bowl, once I see the ball at the center of the bowl, I no longer have enough information to be able to tell where it was dropped, right? So because all of the end states converge, right, on just the ball being the center of the ball being the center of the bowl does not itself discriminate between different places that I might drop it. And so the idea is that's an example of an information destroying process. And part of what Derek's claim is look, when we look at what we've learned about paleontology, what we've learned about archaeology, we should expect there to be a lot of processes that destroy information. We should expect there to be a very sort of gappy kind of record. And indeed, it is often a very sort of gappy sort of record. So here's the example that everyone uses. This is a little scene from the Cambrian. Under normal conditions of fossilization, where only hard body parts are going to be fossilized, this is what we would expect to see in the record. Right? So this sort of gives you a sense of how rich a assemblage can be, and then how little information we in fact get from it. And so we can ask of Turner, is there a particular method associated with the historical sciences? And he doesn't really think so. He doesn't think that there's this sort of archetypical historical method, an archetypical archaeological method, experimental method. He thinks that scientists just do what scientists can do. And then you ask, well, are they impoverished? And he says, yes, they are. Because we're going to have information decay, we're not going to have as much information, and we can't do experiments to sort of make that better. Now, it's worth noting that Derek doesn't mean that paleontology or archaeology is a bad science, right? He just thinks they have a harder job. One of the things I quite like about Turner's, a view like Turner's, is that it lets you say things like, well, sure, there are those easy sciences like physics and chemistry and like evolutionary biology and those sorts of things. Those are easy, right? You can do experiments to generate your evidence if you're doing those sorts of sciences. The real hard sciences are paleontology, archaeology, and geology, because you've just got such limited evidence and it's so brilliant that we know anything. So he does think they're impoverished, but it's important to note that he doesn't think that, he thinks that means they're harder to do, as opposed to paleontologists are somehow bad scientists, if that makes sense. So before we go into the break, let's do a quick comparison of Turner and Cleland. So the reason that Cleland thinks that she's so sort of optimistic about the historical sciences is that she thinks that she points to kind of wave type phenomena. She thinks that evidence tends to spread and diversify from its source, right? And because of that, because of this tendency for events in the past to have causes in the past, to have more and more effects downstream, there's going to be lots of different information you can navigate between, and that's why you use smoking gun reasoning. So she thinks this, and sometimes she'll go so far as to say actually historical science is better than experimental science for that kind of reason. We can compare that to Turner. Where for Turner, he says because evidence decays, historical science is in a bad position. So we can think about them as sort of pointing to two different sort of forces acting in the historical record. One is the force of sort of causal dispersal. As time goes on, effects upstream have more and more effects downstream. And the more different things you have downstream, the more resources you have to go back to the past. Whereas Turner points out that information is also degrading and decaying. And in that sense, you have a worse situation. And so in a lot of ways, the debate seems to turn on whether or not we think information destruction or information retention is more important, right? What is more characteristic of these various records, of the archaeological record, the fossil record, and so on and so forth. So I think what I want to do is I want to take a little kind of break here and maybe give us sort of, now it seems like I'm perfectly at 6 minutes in, 6 o'clock. So what I might do is give us a sort of 5-minute break. Does that work for people? Yep, okay. And I think in that 5 minute break, what I want you to do is reflect a little bit on what we've been talking about. And if you've got, come back with questions if you have some. So we'll come back in 5 minutes. And that's a good time for you to go like, what here seems stupid? What do I understand? What don't I? Et cetera, et cetera. And so feel free to ask me some stuff. Oh, yeah. In particular, think about this. If you are someone who does a type of science, does this feel like it's talking sensibly about what you do? And if it's not, why not? So fantastic. Talk to you in 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for this. But what I'm thinking is that I'm constantly missing social aspect in the past, because as archaeologists we are thinking about natural phenomena, but also social phenomena. When you are saying that we are looking for strange, something weird, something like surprising correlations according to Cleland, and that historical sciences are based on existing natural phenomena. So I'm thinking in practice, although we are doing both in archaeology, social and natural phenomena, we know that there is a big difference how we are doing that. And it's strange for me that we are talking just about natural phenomena.
Good. So there's a question here. There's a bunch of things in there, right, Monica? So one question is something like, clearly Cleland has in mind something like geology and paleontology, but she's using this term historical science, right? And she seems to want to include archaeology in there. And so if she's including archaeology, she cannot mean natural phenomena alone, because of course archaeologists very, very often are looking at not natural phenomena, you're looking at artifacts. And so the interesting question then is, does this look different if we think about it in terms of artifacts? And I think that probably I would guess that what Cleland's going to say is, no, the archetypical reasoning is still the same. You have an interesting pattern in the, archaeological record, some interesting correlation between this type of copper and this type of arrowhead or whatever, right? And then you go, well, here's some hypotheses about how these things may have turned up in the past. And then you go and start sort of discriminating them. And I think archaeologists do that sometimes, but I don't think it's a particularly good way of characterizing what archaeologists do a lot of the time. I think, and so one thing you might be pointing out here is that social phenomena are very different to natural phenomena, right? So something that archaeologists often worry about a lot is the contingency of human behavior, the plasticity of human behavior. So my capacity to get information about fossils turns on taphonomy. I've got this like good science that tells me about how a bone becomes a rock, and works in very regular ways. Great, cool stuff. What could you have that would be the analog of that for human culture and human behavior? Human cultures are much, much, much weirder and weird in the sense of sort of contingent and idiosyncratic than the sorts of things that then the way that remineralization happens. And so you might use that to say something like, well, maybe archaeology actually is in a harder situation than paleontology because of the idiosyncrasy of culture, which is a way of saying, really, that it's just that the material record of archaeology is significantly more underdetermining, as it were, than the one in paleontology. Was that sort of getting at the sort of thing the sort of worry you had?
Yeah, that's much of it. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think for what it's worth, my sort of sense here is that, I mean, I don't think that there's anything, what's the right way of putting this? I tend to think that, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, that I think that both archaeologists and paleontologists are significantly more opportunistic and creative than they seem to be on the kind of view that Cleland pushes. And once you see that, then they seem to be more similar, if that makes sense. But I agree that I think if you take Cleland's view really seriously, then the idiosyncrasy of human behavior becomes a real problem. So I think, and there's a question about, well, is that bad for archaeology or bad for Cleland's view? Right. We have a hand in the room, as we call it.
Thank you. I actually have a comment that maybe interprets like a question. I don't think that data scarcity is a problem, actually. I think that data scarcity is good for science because I think there is a asymmetry. If we have abundance of data, we have a scarcity of meaning, and if we have a scarcity of data, we have abundance of meaning. We have, I don't know, in some sciences, like maybe archaeology, we have some data or some damage data, but then we have something else to rely on. We provide some theories and confront those theories, and on high theoretical level we will choose between two confronted theories, and we will approach hypotheses in different way. And I don't think that way is necessarily bad. And in some sciences where we have abundance of data, we don't really focus on theories in precise sense and in methodological way that would be, I don't know, necessary for a good science. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I find this stuff really interesting, right? Because it's definitely true that once there are a whole bunch of weird things that start happening once you have a large amount of data. Once you have a large amount of data, it becomes really difficult to, or it becomes really easy to find patterns in that data, and it becomes really difficult to show that the patterns you're finding are meaningful, just due to the laws of large numbers and things like that. And so you do get these extra challenges when you have extra data. And the other thing you said, which I really liked, was, which I think is really correct, is that the sorts of questions that historical scientists ask is intimately related to the kinds of things they find in the record, right? They're really tailoring the sort of questions they're asking and the approach they're doing very much to what traces they have, or what traces they think they might be able to find. And I think that's a really important aspect of the sort of strategy. But I'm not sure if I want to go so far as to say that less data is good, because you might think the sort of following, like, if I had another platypus tooth, if I had two platypus teeth rather than one, then I would suddenly have information about, I'd have the capacity to compare those two teeth. There is more information potentially that I could get, right? As you say, it's going to turn a lot on how rich my understanding of those processes that form that data is. But I certainly think that I agree with you that a small amount of data can be really great if you make sure you're answering the right sort of question. But I take it that that means that when I don't have much data, I can only answer certain types of questions, and that seems bad, yeah? It seems like I should be able to ask more questions. I mean, interestingly, it might be that once I have lots and lots of data, that the kind of questions I could ask end up kind of being constrained in other ways as well. But yeah, no, I think that you can't be, like, people tend to say very quick things about the epistemic results of how much data you have. More data equals better. And I think that that's clearly false for the kinds of reasons that you've sketched. So I want to check if anyone else has any questions at this point. Yeah, Emma.
Yeah, thank you for this. This is sort of a not fully baked question, so I guess I'll just sort of kick it out and see if there are reactions. But this binary distinction sort of between experimental and historical sciences is really fascinating to me. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about how these kinds of debates within historical science philosophy maybe have been present in experimental. I'm sure that anti-realism is sort of touching on that, but I guess I'm just thinking if the scope of the observation or the observer is bounded and the phenomena themselves are more extended, so maybe a long-term experiment where it's extended into the future and you can't necessarily rely on the observation. Maybe legacy data is more important then because you need good records of what's come before. But it seems like there's something really interesting in the temporal extension into the future as well, if we buy that dichotomy.
Yeah, no, that's really nice. So something that's really weird about, or I think a little bit weird at least, about Cleland's view is that she's not describing all experimental science by any stretch of the imagination. She's explaining like certain types of lab-based science where you have these relatively controlled sort of regularities and you've got these systems you can use. But there's stuff I might want to know about the future, which is quite far away, as it were. It's quite temporally extended. And one thing you might start wondering is the thing Cleland's getting at not so much to do with the past and the future, and more to do with this notion of temporal extension? Is it just that as we're interested in things that are on these bigger or more bigger, both spatial and temporal scales, suddenly the capacity of experiments to sort of be particularly informative becomes really difficult? And I think that's, you know, in the philosophy of experimentation, people don't make the sorts of claims that Cleland makes. Like, she's really tailored what she's saying. I think her account of experimentation actually has some interesting insights, but usually in the philosophy of experiment, the questions are more about, you know, when something counts as an experiment and when doesn't it? What's the difference between an experiment and a simulation and a model? What's the relationship between an experiment and theory? And they don't really, unsurprisingly, philosophers of science haven't spent a long time thinking about paleontology and archaeology. I think they would have been better at their jobs if they had. But yeah, so you're absolutely right. There's something that's kind of interesting is that Cleland seems to be talking about cases where you have quite temporally bound cases. And if you start thinking about, you know, climate projections, you know, these sort of more sort of future focused things, then things start looking a lot more like, say, paleontology and archaeology. Another way of thinking about this is it doesn't really get to the past at any point. That is, I don't even think it's about the past. If you look at people who try and understand animals that live in the deep sea, so if you look at people who are trying to understand, say, an example I've used is colossal squid. So a colossal squid, you can't get it to the surface and keep it alive because they're adapted to living in really high pressure situations. And so you can't do experiments on living colossal squid. They live in deep sea environments. They're really hard to find. And when you look at people trying to understand colossal squid, it looks like paleontology. They look at the way that little squid behave. They try and dissect the kind of weird corpses of, you know, decomposed corpses of colossal squid they do have. You know, it just looks the same to me as what people do with the platypus. And that's not about time. It's about accessibility, right? And one way of something being inaccessible is it being at a temporal scale such that we can't get it. And I suspect another one is also spatial scale, not just living at the bottom of the ocean, but trying to understand an ecosystem or a global. I can't do an experiment on the biosphere. You know, so I think that there's like Cleland is drawing distinctions in a way which are extremely tailored towards her making a particular kind of argument. And I think that maybe it works in the context of that argument, maybe. But once you start thinking about other cases, then actually things start looking a lot messier. And I think that's a fun aspect. This is one of the reasons why I like thinking about this stuff, was you start going, oh, but how does that work here? Oh, weird. Yeah. But yeah, Judith?
I've been thinking, with you giving the example of the platypus, about Georges Cuvier. And I was been thinking about the commentary that Thomas Huxley wrote on Cuvier, which he called The Method of Zadig. And what he was talking about there, he was really just criticizing Cuvier's, who is always thought to be a bit of a magician, being able to infer from one vertebra an entire animal. He's saying, well, no, what that is just the common sense practice of inferring from an effect to the cause competent to produce that effect. So what he was basically saying is that if you observe nature well enough, and if you observe certain kinds of animals, then you will find that there are a number of anatomical correlations between them. So if you then find a footprint, you will know what kind of animal produced it. You know, you'll know something about their teeth, their jaw, and so on, and even the shape of their legs, because you know the animals. Now, of course, one of the problems with paleontology is that we can observe the present very easily, but we don't know that those correlations necessarily appear in the past as well. And much of the time they actually do, but some of the time we are very surprised when they don't. So I was just wondering if you can say something within this context about inferring from the present to the past.
Yeah. So one ways of so for those, I mean, again, we're in an environment where like some people know heaps and some people know very little. But Cuvier is a kind of titan of kind of pre-evolutionary comparative morphology. So he's like the sort of big dude who really gets comparative morphology going, and it's certainly in the sort of 19th century is kind of thought of being kind of the sort of think of him as kind of being he's held in a sort of Newton-like esteem by people doing comparative morphology around, in the 19th century. And so, yeah, so there's something really interesting about sort of, I care a lot about this very biological way of thinking that comparative morphologists and paleobiologists do all the time, which is you think about your animal as the sort of complete living object, this critter, this lineage, and you situate it within what it's related to, its ideas about its development, ideas about its evolutionary ancestry, ideas about its adaptation, and you do this like really rich integrative way of doing business. And I think I kind of sketched that a little bit using the platypus case, right? And you might think to sort of go a little bit with like, what Monica was pressing on, right? That's something that like we are so lucky that life is a thing that evolves in the way that it does, because it means that we've got really rich information, not in a sort of boring law-like regularity kind of way necessarily, but also in this rich integrative way where I can think of an animal as being the sort of living, breathing thing, and I can connect it to the rest of life in doing so. Now, of course, sometimes very often, we get this very, very wrong, right? Derek Turner delights in coming up with examples of us getting it very, very wrong. One of the funner discussions he has is about, I think it's, the duck-billed dinosaurs, where the duck-billed dinosaurs have these big flat, sort of these very flat, sort of big feet, which were originally interpreted as being like duck feet. And so there was this idea that they must have been living semi-aquatically, which got increasingly weird as it turned out these things were living everywhere. And so there's this bit where it's like, I guess everything was really swampy during this period. And it turns out, no, they actually just had like, it was more like sort of flat feet for doing this. So this is an example of sort of a bad use of, well, I don't know if it was bad at first, but an analogy sort of leading us astray. So I think a lot of the time that comparative method I find incredibly powerful, but there are ways in which it can massively misfire. And to be honest, I don't have a good story exactly about when it does and when it doesn't. I suspect taking one idea and running too far with it, which seems to be what happened with the duck-billed dinosaur, seems to be one mistake. You want to make sure you're able to like embed it in as much information as possible, but it can go wrong. Let's go, before I move on, we've got another question in the room and then I'll shift to the actual paper.
What do you actually think? You mentioned a few analogies that people commonly used between these historical sciences, their methods, and the natural sciences, physics, experimental physics. I mean, it's always immediately sort of obvious, like the limitations of these comparisons. Why would we compare any natural science, let alone historical science, to experimental physics or to experimental particle physics? I never really understood that. I mean, if you go just a step further and you compare historical sciences to, say, thermodynamics, you suddenly start getting really much closer analogies, actually, right? That you get some kind of generalizations which work, but you can't get the details of your system and so on. That's much more. So it's really sort of sort of a disfavor to us understanding the methods of historical sciences if we go immediately for experimental physics. Because really experimental physics, especially particle physics, is actually an outlier if you look at the sort of domain even of natural sciences, let alone of sciences in general. But then it goes a bit further. like if we talk about predictions, I mean predictions of what? If I ask archaeologists, so if you look at the settlements which are older than 20,000 years, they're going to tell me exactly what materials I will be able to find there, what technologies, and they will have very precise predictions and all sorts of predictions of that sort. Then the experiments, I mean, many experiments, even in physics, let alone other areas, are not, I have a clear hypothesis which is quantified, and then, another one, I do the experiment, and then I get there are a bunch of exploratory experiments where experimentalists have just a faint clue what's going on, and that's how they experiment. So, I mean, as helpful as it may look to compare historical sciences to these natural sciences and their methods, it is as sort of a helpful, I think, to kind of realize that these experimental sciences are actually very diverse in terms of their methods. And so, I mean, do you have any, I'm sure you have, sort of views on that?
I totally agree. So the reason that they're comparing experimental science of that type, the reason that things like particle physics are what they have in mind, I take it is partly just historical contingency. It's partly just those were the things that philosophers were interested in. But maybe the better answer is they think that those are the best sciences. Those are our paradigmatic successful science is, particle physics. So that's how they're kind of thinking of it. And if you think that there's one way of being a good scientist, then you can kind of see why you might look at your paradigmatic good scientist as a way of understanding it. Now, of course, I don't think there's one good way of doing science. And in fact, I agree with you that the differences between these different sciences, as you pointed out with the archaeologists, the differences within the sciences, the disciplines that we talk about, are much, much more often than the differences between the different sciences. Because scientists are very good at adapting a method which is good for the thing that they're interested in understanding, right? And so scientists grab the method that's going to work for them. And so I think that my view is that these categories like experimental science and historical science are horrifically too abstract. They can be useful for sort of centering our minds in certain ways. They can be useful for us in finding differences, right? That's a nice reason to draw a distinction. But the idea that the justification of these sciences should lie in those broad abstract categories is not a view that I, find attractive. I think what Cleland is going to say, though, is she's going to say something like, yes, of course, there are lots and lots and lots of exceptions. This is a messy thing that humans do. My job as a philosopher is to give you a kind of explanatory model. And what this model does is it explains why most of the time, or in some sense or somehow, that is what historical scientists do. And this explains what some experimental scientists do. And I mean, personally, I think that there are two things. So one, you've pointed out, as there are so many exceptions that you start worrying that it has that much grip. And for me, the sort of stronger worry is that actually once you look at what they're doing in more detail and start thinking about the kind of strategies they adopt, actually the answer Cleland's giving isn't really capturing why these sciences work the way they do and why that they're successful. So I agree with her, if anything, with more disagreement than you have. I disagree with her perhaps even more than you've expressed, if that makes sense. So let's move to Alexander before I move on.
Oh, thank you. Somehow the discussion reminds me of a great discussion back in 60s and 70s of the last century regarding processual archaeology and the problem of analogy. And what Judith said is exactly what Binford referred to as actualistic method. He said, if I see a trait of an animal, a very large animal, if in a wood, I don't know that it is a bear because I've never seen a bear. But later, if I see a bear, then I know that it is a trait that is a mark left by this huge bear. And that brings us to, I think, the most important question of this lecture is, and that is the past observable? Well, of course, the dynamics of the past is not observable, but traits of the past are observable either in paleontology, in geology, or archaeology. And therefore, experimental method in archaeology is rather good in proving some of the dynamics, that is, how dynamics creates the traits that we can see. For example, how something could have been made, how something could have been destroyed, how something cannot be made, what is impossible. So this kind of experiments help us to infer, and whole this problem was, of course, raised by this word analogy that was mentioned just recently. And that's why I said that it reminds me of Binford and this huge debate, and of course of Alison Wiley's book about it, use and abuse of analogy. But I think that we'll hear more about it in due time.
Yeah, there's no doubt that's going to come up a lot. You're absolutely right that there's a lot of what's going on here that I think can be thought of in terms of sort of folks like Binford and the way that sort of processualists thought about what they were doing. So this is I think this will certainly come up next week, right? So next week's reading, we're going to be looking specifically at some experimental practices within archaeology, and a lot of what you just said there, Alexander, really sort of we'll see what you think about the paper, because it sounded good. I think what you said sounded like the sorts of things I say in that paper, but it might be that when you come to read them, you think, no, actually, this is. So I look forward to sort of hearing that. I do want to sort of actually sketch through the paper. And I've got sort of just a few slides on that. So perhaps we'll go for the one more question, and then I'll, spend 15 minutes just lecturing again, and then we'll go back and sort of finish off with more. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for your lecture so far and today's reading. And I was particularly interested in this distinction and the need for it between phenomena time and data time. And what I wanted to ask is, and you yourself note that this kind of boundary is often blurry, but would you say that the need for such a distinction reflects the idea that there is sort of this objective reality that exists outside of our perception of it, or rather that scientific practice brings all these realities into existence? I mean, I'm not saying dinosaurs are merely constructs, but rather meshworks of scientific practice and material traces and our fancy and our ideas. So what would you say would be the utility, and why is there a need for such a distinction?
Great. Let's find out. I'm going to sort of share my screen and go and look at that stuff, because I think that's a great sort of lead into it. And maybe, in fact, it would be really useful to come back to that kind of question about what work this distinction is doing for us. So just to be like super quick with stuff, because this is, because I know that you sort of read the paper. It's worth sort of pointing out that in that paper, I'm kind of, in some sense, I'm not really arguing against myself. I'm rather saying that I shouldn't have bothered having that debate in the first place. But in a bunch of places in Rock, Bone and Ruin, the way that I respond to sort of Cleland and Turner is by saying something like, Cleland has made historical reasoning too simple. And one of the reasons that that's bad is that if you want to understand how it is that we're able to find out so much about the past, you really have to adopt or to understand how opportunistic they are. So one way of putting it is, you might say that there's the kind of messiness of paleontology and archaeology, and that's a good thing. You might say the fact that There are lots of different sort of approaches, lots of different methods. This gives us lots of different evidence, and it gives us lots of different perspectives, both of which are really important for zeroing in on your evidence. Related to this, as we'll talk about next week, there's also a kind of creativity. There's a real, like, archaeologists and paleontologists in particular are really often brilliant at coming up with things that look kind of wildly speculative compared to what other scientists are allowed to say. And I think they do this for a very good reason. They do this because what they're doing is they're speculating in a way that gives them more evidence about the past. It gives you new ways of finding out about stuff. And they're also sort of, as I call it, methodologically omnivorous. If you're a paleontologist or an archaeologist, you often spend a lot of time really developing new techniques and new tools in a way that you don't see in many experimental labs. So if you go to a sort of, a normal biology lab, someone working on model organisms, and you ask the master's students, the PhDs, what they're doing, what they will only rarely say is, I'm working out a new technique to do this thing, right? And if they are, that'll be like something that the whole lab is doing. Whereas you find all the time in paleontology, someone just even at the level of just a master's student, they'll be trying to do some weird new thing. They'll be developing some new bit of software. They'll be trying to use new experimental technique. They'll be, they're very, very, very much more creative and speculative with what they're doing. And I think that's for good reason. And so the kind of view that I try and sketch in this book is, look, you need to understand this opportunism and this creativity in order to understand how it is that we're able to find out so much about the past. And this sort of leads you to this kind of impasse. So should we think that we're going to know a lot about the future, or should we think we're going to know, a lot about the past, or should we think we're going to know not very much about the past? Derek says, hey, you're not going to find much evidence. I say, yes, but they're very, very creative. And then we go, well, okay, but like, what are we supposed to do about that, right? You might say, so Joyce Havstad argues, I think, fairly convincingly, that the right position here is kind of an agnosticism. It's like, I don't know what we're going to find out about in the future. But I also think that Turner has a really nice response to this, which he says, maybe as a philosopher, I can sit there and go, well, I don't know what we're going to find out. But if you're a practicing scientist, you have to make bets. You have to say, here's where we're going to go and dig. Here's the kind of experiment I'm going to do. You have to have some sense, I guess, about what strategies are going to be successful. And so I think maybe if even as a philosopher, you say, I don't know whether Derek's right or Adrian's right or whatever, as a scientist, you have to have some grip on the context of pursuit. What things should I be doing and trying to find out about? So when I was talking about this rock, this funny shaped rock, I really spoke about it in terms of what Leonelli would call phenomena time. So this is coming back to this distinction that was just asked about. I sort of was thinking about the rock as something which was is somehow downstream from an extinct platypus. But that obviously is not the only way that we might think about this. Indeed, when people think about when discoveries are advertised on paleontology, when this rock was first in a newspaper going, hey, wow, we found a new thing, we often imagine that what happens is someone's out in the field, they're out in the desert of Australia, and they look down and they see this funny shaped rock and they go, my God, I found a platypus, right? And that's not at all what happened. What happened was they found this big assemblage of rocks in Riversley, they dug them out, they took them to the museum. They spend a bit of time, large numbers of people preparing these fossils, these little teeths, and then this thing sat in a drawer for years. And then some graduate student was going through the drawer and was like, oh, wow, look at this weird tooth. This tooth is too big, right? The discovery actually happened much later after extraction, and that kind of often happens. So that's to tell the story of kind of data time. And so Sabina is drawing this distinction between the things that happen to an object, as it were, sort of prior to extraction or something, or the thing you use the object to infer to, and the object as a human artifact, as something which is being prepared as data. Now, the question that was asked there, I thought, with Lennius was very interesting, because on the one hand, I mean, I never really know what to say about stuff about the existence of the external world and our representations of it and stuff like that. I'm a very shallow philosopher in the sense, so I don't really know what to say about the ultimate nature of reality or whatever. But I do think there's something really weird about drawing a distinction between the sort of data itself, as it were, and the sort of phenomena, right? There's something different about the sort of fossilized tooth once it's been sort of cleaned up, and somehow the tooth when it's still in the ground. There's almost a sort of natural artificial distinction working in the background. But I think there's a pretty clear way of justifying this distinction, which is, look, I don't think Leonelli is saying anything particularly metaphysical here. I think what she's doing is she's saying, hey, notice that the way that people think about historical evidence and think about the loss of historical evidence is in terms of geological processes, in terms of phenomena time. When also we should pay a lot of attention to what happens to it when it's been prepared as data by scientists. And I think, like, as you can probably tell from the paper, I found this idea extremely exciting. And I found it extremely exciting because it really captures something important about paleontological practice. So here's a fossil preparation room. This is the unprepared fossil room in the Royal Tyrrell Museum. So all of those big weird shapes are fossils in sort of big plaster of Paris. They've been extracted and kind of brought into this museum in this huge room. And a lot of those were extracted in sort of the 60s and 70s, and no one's got around to preparing them yet. Right, so these things have been extracted and then they're just kind of sitting there. And this sort of gives you a sense of the sort of discovery you might be able to have. Like, who knows what's within those plasters of Paris, right? Some things you might start creating will be exciting, some won't be. Here's Mark Mitchell. He's, in some sense, an extremely lucky fossil preparator because he was in charge of preparing this nodosaur at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. And this is a absolutely outrageously beautiful and incredible fossil. It looks like it's kind of mummified in some sense. And this took 5 years of work. So it was 5 years of highly skilled work to be able to sort of chip this thing away. And it's a very, very dangerous work. So this is the Cryptosaurus box, where basically someone has started sort of preparing a fossil and has broken it, or it hasn't really worked, and you have to sort of throw it away. And so actually, if you tell the story of historical inference in the way that Turner does, the way that Cleland does, and to an extent the way that I did, in Rockburn and Ruin, you're really missing the vast majority of what paleontologists and archaeologists spend their time doing, which is preparing and working with data. Archaeologists go to the field a bit sometimes, but they spend much more time not in the field with all the stuff they've dug up, trying to work out what to do with it. Another reason why this sort of discussion of data time is really important is because it allows us sort of to talk about the sort of work in science and technology studies, particularly by Caitlin Wiley. So not Alison Wiley, Caitlin Wiley. It's very annoying that there are two people whose last names are Wiley in this discussion. But Caitlin goes and looks at the work of fossil preparators, so people who aren't paleontologists, but they're involved in, like Mark Mitchell, in preparing these fossils. And it turns out that there's a lot of skill and creativity that goes into those sorts of processes. And Caitlin has a bunch of really interesting discussions. She's got a new book out, which is really, really good, where she sort of talks about the way that those sorts of sciences go. The case I use in the paper is Bird. So it's the 1940s. I love how kind of Depression era Bird looks. And he's going to the Polixi River, as you know, and has dug up basically this huge section of trackways. And in the story, like, the reason I'm using this case study is really because I think it brings to bear, really makes us think about the way in which different data management as well as data analysis methods matter just absolutely crucially for the sorts of things we might find out about the past. So in this study, we sort of are able to use these photogrammatic techniques to just kind of recreate the fossil record, the trackways as they were when Bird photograph them. And I find it really weird and really fascinating and kind of beautiful that in this case, in order to reconstruct the past, you have to, the deep past, you have to reconstruct the relatively shallow past, right? To understand what Bird was doing, to understand what we can learn from these trackways, I have to first understand what Bird was doing. And something which I think is a kind of interesting lesson from this, which I take, which I've sort of say here, and I've said in the little element book I sent, that's also true of all data. Anytime you're using data to make an evidential claim, that turns on a claim about the history of that data. Because you have to know where the data came from. You have to know that the data hasn't changed in dangerous ways since it was produced, right? You have to know about the history of the data in order to use it as evidence. And so in a sense, all data is legacy data in this kind of way. It's just more extreme in this instance. And I think that once you take seriously this idea of, data time, and again, I don't think there's anything metaphysically going on here. It's just that, as a matter of fact, scientists dig up fossils and do stuff with it. They, they catalog things and so on. Once you see that, then you realize that actually it's not just a question, like the way that Joyce Havstad put it was, is the past itself information preserving or information destroying? And she was thinking of phenomena time. And we realize actually this is true of data time as well. Is data time information preserving or information destroying? And you see these interesting cases where actually paleontologists really are kind of adopting these practices to make sure that along data time, things are well preserved. That's why Bird took the photographs and made the video that he did. That's why, we store and catalog things in the ways that we do. And this is kind of one thing I sort of like about this, is that in a sense, we're making a claim that is the most mundane you could ever imagine. It's like we're picking at the most boring stuff that paleontologists do is take photos of like sites, right? But actually those things are crucially important for understanding the epistemic standing of the inferences they draw. And it matters for the kind of bet we're talking about, right? Remember, the bet is, are we going to know a lot about the past, or are we going to know not very much about the past? And I think that once you bring in data time, things just get wild, because suddenly I don't just care about how often things get preserved in the fossil record. I now care about all of these myriad practices to do with how various people manage data. So the number of variables involved just become kind of intractable, right? And so I kind of think that this debate that I think was useful and interesting, because it let us, say lots of interesting stuff about how paleontology and archaeology work. In terms of putting it in terms of sort of a pessimistic position that says we won't know much, or an optimistic position that says we'll know heaps, is kind of missing the point at this stage, right? I don't think we can answer that question particularly interestingly, simply because there's so many different variables that you have to take into account. But I take it that one thing that the paper I've got us to read this week is doing is I'm saying, but that's okay, because I think there's a different way that we can do a philosophy of science. Instead of asking these questions about, realism or making bets about the future, we can instead ask questions about the kind of situations that historical scientists find themselves in. You go out and you survey, look at the different cases of how scientists are overcoming various types of challenges, and start understanding the kind of productive strategies that they have. And so I think a way that I would like to sort of recast my work in lots of ways is, instead of it being sort of arguments for optimism or pessimism, people are welcome to do so, of course. I think something that's more useful is to sort of look for productive strategies, look for, when you're facing these sorts of challenges, when you've got epistemic scarcity, what should you do? What sorts of strategies are going to be productive and what aren't? And then we can start going around and looking for other places where there are similar epistemic situations. And then we might find that there's more, we might link, like we did earlier, we might link things that are in the deep future with things in the deep past. Maybe there are strategies that'll work across those contexts. Maybe we can start thinking about the way in which paleontology is very similar to like deep marine biology. Maybe those are kind of similar, right? There's a huge range of questions that start rise up once we start asking questions in this kind of way. And so that, I think, is what I'm up to. And we have, like, of course, sort of some time left. But I want to say one thing. I mean, I don't know if I really captured the question about the relationship between phenomena time and data time. But regardless, I'm sort of interested in what you guys think at this point. Whether everyone has any more questions? Yeah, Francisca.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I wanted to ask about this last point where you make this difference about productive strategies and talk about them as an alternative to talking about underdetermination and making bets and arriving at optimism or wherever, really. And because in the paper, I'm not sure I fully understood the difference there, because if we look at productive strategies, it also involves making bets about whether they will be successful, and we might not know where we use it, and don't you then run into the same problem potentially? So yeah.
Brilliant question. That's such a good question. Yeah, I like it. It's a sort of there's like meta uncertainty. It's like, wait, well, how do I know that the strategy is productive? That's really helpful. Like, that's not quite occurred to me like that before. And I think here's what's going on. The idea is supposed to be that well, I've got two things to say. One, absolutely, there's always going to be betting. Like when I said earlier, when you're a scientist, you have to bet all the time, right? You have to go like, I mean, actually, when you're a scientist, what you do a lot of the time is you convince funders to let you bet. So a lot of it is convincing funders that you have a good bet to make, regardless of whether you think it's a good bet. But regardless, that betting is always going to happen. What I'm thinking is there might be ways of articulating, given that you're in a certain type of epistemic situation, given that you have a bunch of challenges, here is a strategy that will be likely to work. Now, you might be wrong, right? It's likely to work. It's not going to be guaranteed. But I take it that it's not kind of as much of a sort of blind bet or as general a bet, because I have an account that connects the epistemic situation to the strategy. So, for instance, when I say a really good strategy when you're often when you're a paleontologist is to give these sort of speculative narratives. And I say the reason that a speculative narrative can be really helpful is twofold. One thing that it does is it connects all of your little things in the past together, right? It gives you these extra causal links. And once you've got those causal links, you can then start testing them. You can then start going, wait, am I really right that I think that this thing could lead to that thing? And that gives you a whole bunch of new questions to ask. And that's really good. Another reason why these speculations are good is because they kind of, Popper stuff, they stick their necks out in this way that enables sort of further testing. The claim is the reason you should do that is because it's really hard to find evidence. There are contexts in which it's quite easy to find evidence, right? If I'm doing sort of molecular studies, my difficulty is not how do I get evidence? My difficulty is what evidence do I care about, right? And in that situation, you should adopt a different strategy. And as a philosopher, my job is to sort of to connect the strategy to the situation. So no doubt there's a whole bunch of induction going on here. But my hope is that I'm able to give a sort of account of why this strategy is a good one, given that kind of context. And I think that's a different sort of debate than the debate where we go, do we think that most information from the past is preserved or not? At least I hope so. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful.
But yeah, no, that was a real, I'm embarrassed that I hadn't thought about that question in that way before. That's very helpful. Okay, so given the way that went, I suspect that the way I'll go next week is I might just, because it sounds like once you all get warmed up, you're pretty good at sort of question asking. So I think what I'll do is next week will be more of I'll probably present stuff at the start, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll just have lots of questions and stuff. I think that seemed to work pretty well. So next week we'll be looking at a very, very different paper where we're thinking about experimental practices in archaeology. And this might be a case where, for those of you who are more grounded in archaeology, you'll be able to tell me how wrong I am and more confidently than perhaps you did this time. And then from that, for the week after that, we'll then start having these sessions with guests and so on. So I want to just make clear that the way I'm doing this is kind of open. So I'm kind of fine to sort of mix things up depending on what you think's working or what isn't working. Sarah, do you want to come in?
Sorry, this wasn't the last questions or comments, but I was so slow in finding my little raise hand button that you had a long time. No, I just wanted to make one comment from a paleontology perspective, a bit what we were talking about, particularly with birds example. It's interesting because when you're trained as a paleontologist, they emphasize so much how you're not allowed to use photographs and you're not allowed to depend on these things. And when you go into the field, you always have to make sketches and measurements on your own. And they value that so much more highly than what you might consider more objective evidence. So often there isn't as much photography and other things, and paleontologists look down on that kind of evidence, where they really like this theory-laden one, where even though it's less objective, they find it better because they say, like, the eye of a human is so much better than an eye of a camera. And when you're there and you have the different lighting and you can examine it right there, you can see things that will never be preservable. So even though that strips away, a lot of the chances for the future to make a different interpretation than what you had in the moment, you're still trained to always do that instead. So it's just like one more reason why this kind of data and phenomenon, the ways we work with data is a bit different in paleontology than in other sciences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really looking forward to seeing, as we move along, I'm really looking forward to seeing, it is really surprising the way that paleontologists think about visual skills and think about those sorts of things in a way that is often very different to how archaeologists do, even though, in a sense, they're both doing what looks like a very similar kind of field work. And so particularly next week, when we start thinking about more embodied practice, it's going to be really interesting to sort of bring those features out. So I'm looking forward to that.